Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Monteverde Olivine. I'll do a writing sample on this 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes. I'll take a look at some writing samples that I did earlier on other types of paper. I'll compare Monteverde Olivine to other green inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Monteverde Olivine came off the nib of my glass dip pen very uniformly and very pleasantly. The swatch that I made with tweezers was nice and crisp on this Tomoe River paper. Some of the other papers had a little trouble holding on to the ink for the entire swatch. I don't see any sheen on the drip at the end of the swatch, but the ink does range from very dark to a medium olive green. I'm going to begin with a Pilot Corono. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. This extra fine nib is very pleasant. In fact, it is very smooth on this smooth Tomoe River paper, and it is nice and legible. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom 98. It has a 14 karat number 3 size fine nib. This is a nice, wet, fine nib. You may not be able to tell here, but the upstrokes are just a little bit drier than the downstrokes, and this nib has a little bit of bounce to it. I've been enjoying using darker green inks with this pen. Now, I had Diamine Green Black inked up in this pen, and I still had about a fourth of a fill to go, but I was just dying to try this ink with this pen. And it performs very similarly to Diamine Green Black. In fact, I'm going to compare the two. If I didn't know better, I might think that this was Diamine Green Black. But very smooth. This nice soft nib, I'm able to write with a very light hand, which adds to the smoothness of this nib on the paper. Next, I'll be writing with my Monteverde Pocket Ripma. It has a small, possibly a number 5 size Omniflex nib. A little bit of a hard start there. I was wondering about that. I do have issues with some inks with this nib because the tines stick out so far past the feed. Now, this pen and nib combination are going to take some further testing, some long-term testing, because on the scribble here and just me pausing to talk about the nib, I got another little hard start here. So we'll have to see if this is an ink that will be usable, my Monteverde ink, if it's going to be usable in my Monteverde Ripma. I think Monteverde inks tend to perform pretty well. At least that's been my experience, and I'm really liking the shading. I need to show here. This Ripma is like a tiny little stub, and this is also very smooth. Next, I'll be writing with my Sailor 1911 Standard. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Everybody talks about the pencil-like feedback of the Sailor nibs, and I'm hearing the pencil-like feedback, but it feels very smooth. I'm really liking this pen and ink combination. I like these type of greens with this cream-colored pen, like, what was it, Diatramentis, Jane Austen, and there are other, these type of sagey, kind of dark olive greens. I really like. I should have tried some reverse writing. My Monteverde Pocket Ripma is known to be a good reverse writer, and I did some reverse writing samples on some of the other papers, but I'm going to go ahead and try reverse writing with this Sailor 1911. Okay, it's very, very fine. You can see it was writing kind of dry at first, but then I guess when the ink got down to that side of the nib, it's a little bit wetter. I find myself reverse writing more here lately. I've been using medium and broad nibs, and on occasion, when I'm using one of those wider nibs, I need to write a little smaller, or I need to write a little finer, or not quite as wet. And so I am learning which of my pens and nibs are good reverse writers. Now, I do need to note that just because I have a pen and nib that's a good reverse writer, that doesn't mean every pen and nib of that make will be a good reverse writer. You just have to test them on your own. Like I have a Kaweco broad nib that's an excellent reverse writer and a Kaweco double broad nib that isn't. One thing to check for is if it's scratchy, you can smooth that on some micro mesh. But if it's a very dry writer, I wouldn't recommend messing with the nib, trying to make it wetter, writing in reverse, because if it writes nicely, regular, if you start messing with it in the reverse, you're going to alter the way it writes. But if it's plenty wet enough, it's just a little scratchy, go over it with some micro mesh, but don't do anything that would alter the regular writing. Next, I've got a Conklin Minigraph. It has a tiny little stub nib. I'm going to need to redip this one. I have noticed, and I'll comment when I look at the other writing samples, this nib did tend to dry out pretty quickly. Just like with the Ritma, that's something I'm going to have to test further. I don't know if you can see it, but the upstrokes are quite a bit drier than the downstrokes, and that gives some nice shading through the writing. The nib itself is very nice, and it's not glassy smooth, but I would classify it, oh, that's kind of sloppy, smooth. Very enjoyable to write with, and this Minigraph is my second Minigraph, and though this style of pen wasn't my favorite at first, it's really growing on me. Next, I'll be writing with a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. I wouldn't call this glassy smooth. It's more like satiny smooth. It's got just a little bit of feedback, just enough so that you don't feel like you're going to slide off the page. And the shading's very nice. You can see more of the olive, of this olive green, whereas the finer nibs, you have to look close to see that it's green and not a black ink. This is very pleasant. And let's look at the reverse writing on this one. It has just the slightest bit of tooth to it. Very pleasant to write with. This is a very versatile nib. And finally, I've got my Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel nib. This is a very luxurious writing experience. It feels like velvet when you write. Very enjoyable. While this dries, I'll take a look at some of the other writing samples. This ink on Rhodia was very enjoyable. I'm going to have to work on my lighting because this is hard to tell that it's green. But here you can see the ink wanted to kind of let go of the paper. It's pretty crisp throughout most of the rest of the swatch, but you can see there was still quite a bit of ink on the tweezers. Writing with the glass dip nib was very pleasant. This ink is just very well suited for a wide range of nibs. It's very enjoyable to use in the wider nibs. It looks nice and it's nice and smooth. On my mini graph, I had a little bit of a hard start here with the C and had to go over it again. But once the ink got started flowing, it was very enjoyable. But notice that even after the ink got flowing, the upstrokes are so dry they're almost non-existent. But the writing still looks good. The finer nibs were very pleasant to write with. But my two favorites were the Sailor and the Monteverde. The Sailor is my first favorite. But with the Monteverde Ritma being an olive-colored pen, I am kind of excited to try this ink in it. I wasn't quite as fond of this ink on copy paper. In most of the nibs, I could feel the ink spreading, and I'm just not crazy about that. So the Pilot Corono, when I got down to it, I was kind of surprised by how much I enjoyed it. The Monteverde Ritma and the Sailor just felt a little too wet, but with the Ritma, I came down here and tried writing a little bit larger than I normally write, and it was very pleasant. So these pens that I've said feel a little wet, probably for someone who writes larger and a little bit faster, that would be absolutely fine. But you can see that this ink does want to come through the page, except for the areas where I was doing the reverse writing and the extra fine nibs. They didn't bleed through the page. And the writing sample that I always do in my old Leuchtturm bullet journal. Again, my lighting's not the best, but it's just a very enjoyable, pleasant, dark olive green, and you get some nice shading. And with this 1.5 stub nib, again, it's just a very luxurious writing experience. You can tell these murky green inks are some of my favorites. The first ink that came to mind when I tried this one was Diamine Green Black. And I'm kind of surprised that you really see more of the blue come out in this green black, and especially down here in the corner, you can see Olivine has a bit more yellow in it. In the finer nibs, you don't really see the difference in everyday writing, but then when you get to the broader nibs you see more of the shading, you can see more of the yellow here and more of the more true green, or even maybe leans a little blue. The Atramentis Jane Austen is similar to the green black, but much lighter, so you see more of the yellow in Olivine. I wanted to compare this ink because this was my previous favorite ink to use in that Sailor 1911. Jacquerbon Verde Atlantide is similar but different enough that I think it warrants having a bottle of it. I don't have a bottle of Jane Austen yet, but they're different enough that I think I can justify having a bottle of both. And this does look much more blue compared to Olivine. I wanted to compare what I call a true green and Yeah, it really makes the yellow come out in the olivine. Private Reserve Avocado also leans a little yellow, but when you put it next to olivine, it makes it look a little more true green. Not as much yellow in the avocado. Rohr and Klinger Alt Goldgrün really leans heavy into the yellow. Tokiwa Matsu, similar, but a little bit lighter. I do find that olivine seems to perform better in more pens. You've got a broad range of pens that you can just use without any trouble. The sheen in this Tokiwa Matsu kind of limits you to the pens that it's usable in. And finally, Venta Carlos. I did a search before I started filming this video to make sure this was still available, and Van Ness Pens still has some Venta Carlos, and these are very similar. To test the water resistance of the ink, I do writing samples with all the pens that I've just tested on a little piece of Rhodia graph paper. I let it dry for a while and then I submerge it in water for 10 minutes. And Monteverde Olivine is not water resistant at all. Okay, let's check the back of this 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. And this is a dark ink. There's a lot of show through, but the ink is not really even getting deep into the paper, even in the heaviest parts of the swatches and the scribble with the dip pen. That's all show through because the ink is so dark. I really enjoyed this ink. I was kind of surprised that there wasn't any water resistance. I came into this writing sample not knowing what to expect. One of the Monteverde inks that I've tested relatively recently was I think it was Monteverde Elephant. I would call it too wet. I like Monteverde Olivine much better. I don't know. I think on this smoother paper, if I don't have any issues with the ink drying out, I think the Pocket Ripma is going to be my favorite. I do like the Sailor 1911, but I think I like the 1911 better on the Rhodia paper. I really liked that. But I like the way it looks in this Pocket Ripma. You get some nice shading, and I just love that nib on the Pocket Ripma. It's just a tiny little italic nib. I need to get a Franklin Christoph Sig nib. I've always wanted a fine Sig nib, and I get the impression that it would be similar to this little Pocket Ripma. I really enjoy writing with it. Okay, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.